The panel this afternoon is addressing, in the context of the report that's being prepared, and in the context of dialogue, two major subject areas. The first one is education, and the second is economic development. Through economic development, both issues of poverty, but also issues of opportunity and of inequity. So one of the ironies, or one of the difficulties in framing this discussion, is that many of the formal dialogue processes do not address either of these subject areas very explicitly. So we're looking very much to the panel this afternoon to give us both more grist, more factual information on the dialogues that are ongoing in these areas, and some notion of the directions that they might take. We have three wonderful panelists who will have between 10 and 15 minutes each to speak. First, we have Professor Osman Bakar, who is very well known at Georgetown. He has spent quite a bit of time here over the years, but he is now a professor of Islamic thought in Malaysia. He is a specialist on dialogue, so we're looking forward to a lot of insight from him. So, Professor.
Moderator Katherine, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me from Malaysia to come to this one-day meeting here. Talking about the West-Islamic dialogue in the area of education and intercultural understanding, I think this area accounts for the largest, perhaps the largest group of activities of dialogue that have been taking place both before and after September 11. In my presentation, I would not deal with the question of, for example, the economic development directly, but just want to talk about the context in which the dialogue in the area of education has been organized, has been implemented in the well, both in the West and the Islamic world, but my concentration will be on the Islamic world. In many Muslim countries, when the subject of Islam and education is, when the subject is discussed, the word West is bound to crop up, and that shows, that tells us a lot. I think because, in a sense, the cultural presence of the West in the Islamic world, in the area of education, is something that is very much a reality. This morning in our other session, I mentioned about the presence of Islam and Muslims in the West, which is contested by certain constituencies. The same thing, Muslims look at the presence of the cultural West in the field of education, and after 50 years of independence, roughly, from the Western powers, from independence, and we can see that that presence is very much being debated among Muslims. And that makes the subject of West-Islamic dialogue on the subject of education very, very significant. And I just want to mention here some of the major issues that are in the that are with the Muslims, from different Muslims. What are the major issues at hand when they want to talk about dialogue with the West? I would say that this is true not only of one particular Muslim country, but most Muslim countries. And as I go through these issues, then you can see why the presence of the West is very much talked about. First, a question of illiteracy. I think, of course, this is related to economic development, because in many Muslim countries, the rate of illiteracy is still quite high. Although some countries have done quite well, but the problem of illiteracy remains an issue after 50 years of independence. And the issue of illiteracy, of course, is also related to the question of scripts. When the many parts of the Muslim world, the centuries-old Arabic script have to disappear, and in its place you have the Romanized version of the local language that change also the meaning of illiteracy. Whereas in the colonial period, illiteracy, in the pre-colonial period, illiteracy means just not able to read or write in any script, but after during the colonial period and post-colonial period, illiteracy was measured in terms of the ability or inability to read the Latin or the Romanized script. Now, that is, if we go, for example, just an example, to the Mindanao region in the southern Philippines, where these conflicts have been going on for hundreds of years, the problem of illiteracy is very, very real. Similarly, in the case of southern Thailand, where this conflict is going on there. Now, the second issue, the question of the problem of linguistic pluralism, the problem of language, because when the many Muslim countries like Malaysia, for example, became independent, these countries were confronted with many ethnic groups with different languages. The question of what sort of which language was to be adopted as the medium of instruction, and how much freedom to be given to these various languages as the vehicles of education. That is very much still a problem in many Muslim countries. So I would relate that issue in the larger context of how to deal with cultural pluralism. And if you look at the report, the draft report that has been prepared, I mean, that is related to, there's an issue, a common issue between the West and the Islamic world, how to deal with this problem of pluralism. And the third point here is how to come to terms with modern knowledge. I think the many Muslims have as their background in their thinking, once upon a time, Muslims were advanced in knowledge, where they developed the sciences and so on. Then they come to terms with they have to come to terms with the new reality that most of the modern knowledge has been produced by the West, and the suspicion that this modern knowledge is simply not just knowledge, but also impregnated with, in a sense, with values and with views of the West. The idea that through the system of, through this modern system of knowledge, they are going to lose their traditional identity. This, for some, for many Muslims, this is a foregone conclusion or something that has already been resolved. But therefore, for many others, it's not, because Muslim countries are at different stages of economic development, educational development, and if some Muslim countries have already overcome this issue, others have not. So my point is the issue of how to come to terms with modern and contemporary knowledge is very much an issue. The next point is the role of education in nation building, and in this context, for example, how to deal with the religious other. Even the most advanced of Muslim countries have to face this issue. In other words, I mentioned just now how to allocate these places to different languages, and also religious education. How to accommodate religious education for the different religious groups, that's very much an issue. The role of education in nation building is also about how to relate the kind of knowledge content that is given to the students, how it is going to prepare these students, especially in the multi-ethnic and cultural context, how to build a nation with common goals, with common programs and so on, out of this diverse group of citizens. And the other point here, the issue of Islamic system of education. There is a crux of the matter when it comes to the issue of education. For many Muslims, they see the dominant system of education in Muslim countries today as a kind of Western legacy. Western legacy, and of course, those countries which have dealt with this issue, they have come to terms with one part of it. In other words, they have no problem accepting this Western legacy as being compatible. They see that as being compatible with Islam, but they do not see every aspect of the modern Western education as of that kind. So and because of that, there arises certain movements like Islamization of knowledge, how to make Islam relevant to this modern system of education. This is an ongoing thing, and I think the movement called Islamization of knowledge has happened in a number of Muslim countries until now. When you see Islamization here, also the Islamization of not just simply the knowledge content, but also like teaching methods and also the educational goals, all come under that view of what Islamization means. So the quest among many Muslims, the quest for the Islamic system of education is very much alive. And of course, when they see, for example, in this discourse with the Westerners who do not see the kind of what is the rational basis for that, so you can see the counter reactions coming from the Muslims And this morning here we hear phrases like, I think from Professor Nasser, how some people try to impose their view of the other, to impose their view of the other on the other. I think that is very much true in the case of education, in the discussion of education. People see that many Muslims feel that Westerners do not understand that there is such a thing as a distinct Islamic system of education, while without denying that there are many commonalities between the two systems. So in my country, Malaysia, for example, the issue of Islamization of education is alive to this day, to the point that both the ruling party and the opposition party have to take great interest in this matter. And the other issue is the conflict and tension between, in a sense, two competing systems within the Muslim countries. That is the competition or the conflict between the Western secular model and the traditional model, which most visibly is represented by such institutions as the madrasa, or in the case of Indonesia, by the pesantren. But the arising from this conflict and tension between the two systems that have been going on for many decades, you have the third view that the choice, according to this third view, the choice for Muslims is neither one nor the other, but a kind of synthesis between the Western model and the traditional model. I think this is perhaps also related to the issue of Islamization, because those proponents of Islamization, among other things, they go for this kind of synthesis between these two existing views and systems, namely the Western model and the traditional model. So these are the issues that, in a sense, linger in the background when we have this West-Islamic dialogue on in the field of education. As I said just now, there are many efforts going on in this area, and certainly I myself have been associated, for example, with the Center for Civilization Dialogue at the University of Malaya, established in 1995, where we have discussed, where we have organized and initiated dialogues with academics and students from the West, especially from the United States. Every year, the center would organize seminars and also host at least 10 to or so the academics from different parts of the American universities and other European universities. And of course, the question of dialogue there does not just cover the issues of education, but the thing is, the center being an educational and cultural institution, it is organizing this kind of this dialogue mainly in the area of education. But the implication, I think, the academic and practical outcome of these dialogues not going to be confined to the field of education. If I may refer to the report, I think the other areas of dialogue are going to be impacted by the outcome of this dialogue. Final point, I just want to say that in many parts of the Muslim world, certainly from the region of Southeast Asia, from Malaysia, Indonesia, for example, we have in the post-September period, we have a lot of dialogues going on between these visiting Western academics and students with the local academics on the subject, on various aspects of education, including the curriculum content of the universities, and also the curriculum content of madrasah, which or Pesantren, which has attracted the attention of certain American academics. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll turn now to Ingrid Mattson, who's professor at the Hartford Theological Seminary. She's also the president of the Islamic Society of North America and has substantial experience in Canada and the United States, but also in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to Islamize my academic talk by saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. And I do that just as a kind of exercise to let us think a little bit about context and place and what it means to be able to say what's in your heart or not when you're in an academic institution. Is it permissible to use what's considered religious language in a secular institution? Does it become problematic, an imposition of your religious values in a secular environment? Or is it just being who you are and you would be censoring yourself if not? It's one of the broad issues we need to think about when we talk about West-Islamic dialogue when it comes to education. Let me preface what I'm going to say about education with just a quick remark on the West-Islamic paradigm that a number of people have mentioned, and in the report we've examined. My complaint has not been the terms West and Islamic, but the terms world. It reminds me of that infamous book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, or the other way around. I can't remember. But as if two genders were from two different planets. And Western and Islamic world makes it sound like we just do not live on the same earth. So, but at the same time, I wouldn't advocate a radical individualism. We are part of communities, cultural communities, historical communities, and that's why I prefer to talk about Western and Muslim communities, because you can have Muslim communities in a Western environment. You can have a Western community plopped down in the middle of an Islamic environment with high walls in their compounds so they could have their swimming pool and golf and tennis courts in the midst of some Middle Eastern environment. So we have our mutual ghettos. So I want us to think a little bit about that and what it means to have communities that are intersecting at various levels, but at the same time have some kind of boundaries. When it comes to education, first of all, it seems to me that many of those people who speak about Muslims and education need to have an education themselves, because all you have to do is say the term madrasa and it's as if you had thrown a bomb in the middle of the room, when of course madrasa means simply school. There's an assumption that we all know what a madrasa is. Well, that's obviously incorrect. Madrasas can teach all kinds of things. It's simply the Arabic word for school. And so the fact that we need some education on language and terminology and education is about going beyond assumptions is important. That unfortunate incident in New York with the Khalil Gibran school we all have heard about is a point that we should all take note about, where the community were under the instigation, really it wasn't the community, but people who, for ideological reasons, decided that by even learning Arabic, somehow we, whoever we were, are showing sympathy to those people, the terrorists, showed how much education really is needed when we talk about education itself. I want to look at 3 levels of education and think about what that means when we talk about this dialogue, because this is a huge, big topic. We're supposed to talk about it in 10 minutes, education in the Muslim world and between Muslims and the West. But let me just quickly run through 3 levels of education, and then for a 4th, if it's important, to show some of the challenges. And I want to talk about elementary, secondary, and then post-secondary, so university education. Now, of course, at elementary education, from my perspective, the primary purpose is really formation of the individual, of the child, into to have values and character and be able to become a human being with some core values. At this point, elementary education tends to reflect, or society wants it to reflect, the values of the family and the faith community. If there is a gap between the values of the family and the faith community and the school, there will be a problem, and you'll have families taking their children out of school, which does not happen only in the Muslim world, but in America, there are tens of millions of children who are homeschooled because their Christian parents believe that the public schools do not reflect the values of their family and faith communities. So this is an issue that is not just one that is particular to the Muslim world, but possibly can be a source of dialogue between the Muslim communities and Western communities. What does it mean for a school? To what extent should it be embedded in the community in which it exists and really reflect those values if it's going to be beneficial? At this point, what's interesting is to look at some studies about traditional Islamic education and how, in fact, successful the traditional madrasa system is in answering these needs. There's a great book that I highly recommend by a woman called Helen Boyle called Quranic Schools, Agents of Preservation and Change, a woman who is a scholar of pedagogy and did a comparative study of Quranic schools across different countries, and she showed how some were very successful and how some were not successful. And the most successful ones at the elementary level, in fact, were the ones who followed a traditional pedagogical model that allowed students to go at their own pace, that allowed peer tutoring, that the Western models or the modern models, in fact, failed more students. More students dropped out because it put artificial standards in terms of the student success. But one of the points that she made is that both kinds of schools were very successful in giving the students a sense of embodiment of values. That at that level, memorization of the Quran, which was stressed, was highly beneficial. It wasn't seen as the end of education, but at the beginning of their education, a sort of base or foundation upon which they can form their values and characters and continually refer to. And that the emphasis really was on things like kindness to other children, respect for elders, obedience to parents, all of these things that we want small children, of course, to have. But when we look at education at the elementary level, if we add it to some of the agendas that are on the World Economic Forum agenda, we have to say and acknowledge and emphasize that elementary education will only be successful if children have good health care available to them, that society is providing them with adequate nutrition, and their parents with adequate livelihood. Otherwise, children are never even going to make it to elementary education. So that's a point where there's a lot of discussion and dialogue. Moving to the secondary level, this is the level that I believe is the most problematic, the most dangerous, and the area that we could have the most productive dialogue globally. And why is that? Because in my opinion, that it is once at the secondary level, so let's say adolescence in general, that the main purpose of education is to give these young people a sense of purpose. And education, at this point, the emphasis on what that purpose is will depend on the culture in which you are. So now we find that in America, for example, or until recently, there has been a great emphasis on skills and jobs, a very utilitarian approach to education that is emphasized prominently in secondary school. That approach is fine. That purpose, you know, is it's a choice that society can make about secondary public education, that's the emphasis they want. But if children are being given that emphasis in a society which does not offer them jobs upon graduation, which does not give them a realistic hope that the skills they're learning will be translated into any meaningful opportunity, what does that lead to other than frustration? And I think this is where one of the gaps when we talk about shifting paradigms in secondary education happens, is that if you've moved from a paradigm where the purpose of education is for you to be a well-rounded human being, to further your ability to relate to the society in general and culture in which you live, to a utilitarian one about jobs and skills, and then those things aren't available, you're going to have a huge problem. And so then we need to think about what the purpose of education in fact is. The third level, university education, here is where the values or the approach to education needs to emphasize freedom of thought, independence of thought, intellectual curiosity, a kind of meritocracy, and it's from the university-educated group that we hope to have the intellectual, scientific, educational, political leadership of a country. Now, what's interesting is that we know that at least some Muslim secondary schools must be doing a good job because they've sent many of their graduates to Western universities to be educated, and they do very well. They come here, they do well in university, they do well in professional school, medical school, and beyond. So that as long as there's that avenue for being able to, knowing realistically that they could get a place in university, that they continue to work and they have that, they develop it. But one of the things that seems to me the gap, and this is where we need to have some discussion in terms of education at the university level in the Muslim world, is that there's a certain concept, there's a supplication that Muslims are taught to make before studying that says, "Oh God, let me benefit from the knowledge that I learn, and let me learn beneficial knowledge." Now, what is beneficial knowledge? Just as I believe there's somewhat of a problem in contemporary American public education in having too utilitarian of approach to education, meaning that education is about skills, the skills that you need to have a job, I believe that in many Muslim societies, there's a kind of utilitarian approach to knowledge, which is that we're suspicious of learning or information that does not directly feed into a purpose that is clear. And it's that lack of, you could say, intellectual curiosity that can lead to a stifling of innovation and development. And that is where I believe the Muslim educators and religious leaders need to start thinking. The final, fourth level, since I do have 1 minute left, is the level of seminary education, the education of religious leaders. Now, I teach at a historically Christian seminary that has approximately 35% of its student body now, 35 to 40% that is Muslim. It's a graduate theological institution. And what's very interesting to me is that on the one hand, some of my Muslim students feel that there's somewhat of a disadvantage that they can't study in a completely Muslim seminary, because in a Muslim seminary, they could surround themselves purely by the symbols and discourse and time and space kind of parameters of a Muslim society. But what I ask them is, where do they plan to preach and teach and work when they leave this seminary? And of course, it is in, first of all, predominantly Christian society. And And even if they plan to work in a predominantly Muslim community, they're living in a globalized world. And what we find is that theological education that is co-educational, not in terms of men and women, we used to talk about co-eds before, but co-educational in terms of Christians and Muslims together learning and exploring their religious texts, their sacred texts, their theology, their ethics together, leads to religious leaders who are able to lead their communities in the 21st century, who are not trying to always find some way to recreate medieval models of being in the world, but in fact have been challenged right at the beginning of their theological formation with trying to make what they're doing meaningful and work in the real world, the contemporary world in which they're working. I have a lot more comments, but I've run out of time. Maybe we'll have some time for discussion.
Thank you, Katherine. I suppose most people, if they were organizing a seminar on West-Islamic dialogue, having an Irishman on the panel would not necessarily be high on their priority. First of all, just let me say who I am myself. I'm a religious leader. I'm not an academic. And I look at our meeting here particularly from the point of view of interfaith dialogue and the religious dimensions of this West-Islamic dialogue. I live in a country where Islam is relatively new. We've always had a small number of students, particularly medical students. Mr. Anwar, your wife, I think, also studied in Ireland many years ago. But now we have very much a changing society, where Ireland has moved from being a country of emigration into one of large-scale immigration due to its economic development and our need for labour. For example, in my diocese in Dublin, in the last 5 years, about 100,000 people of Polish origin have come to Ireland. But we have a growing pluralist society in Ireland. And we find ourselves having to go through a process which other Western European countries, it's taken them many, many years to go through. We've had to do it with no infrastructures in a very short time. And even though numbers are comparatively small, there's an interesting for me is that we have the possibility to look and learn where things had gone wrong elsewhere and to try for once to get things right, which is quite a challenging task. So the big challenge is, or the first challenge is that of integration. For the first time, we have a growing Islamic population, but at a time in which the tensions between Islam and West are also present in our society. Fortunately, because of our burgeoning economy, labour is still in very high demand. And there's no way people are saying that Muslims or any other immigrants are taking our jobs and so on. And because of the affluence, there's a certain feeling of benevolence in general in the country, a certain curiosity and welcome and appreciation. And all these play an important role. The Irish are actually very, very nice people. We only kill our own. We have also in Ireland no political party which in any way has attempted to use immigration as a political issue. And I think that's an extremely important thing. We've just had general elections and no party attempted to play this, although the temptation would have been there. And this is due, I think, also to the level of sensitivity which comes from the people being, at least originally, a religious people and who would have rejected something of that kind. However, if we were to have an economic downturn, then who knows if these type of sentiments wouldn't emerge very, very quickly. So we have to use this opportunity to build up the most harmonious relations we can have possible. Katherine mentioned that we have an unusual educational system in which 95% of all elementary schools are religiously run. I am the patron or the owner, I suppose, of almost 500 elementary schools in Dublin. The Constitution would permit any religious group to set up its school, including the Islamic community, and they have set up 2 Islamic schools in Dublin, but the vast majority of the children go to and prefer to go to the Catholic school system, including the chief imams have sent their children to Catholic schools. There is in Ireland a wider debate about the role of religion in Ireland, beginning with the role of the Catholic Church. And it's a curious thing that people are saying, because of the arrival of Islam, the traditional church-state model must change, and Ireland should move to be a more secular state. Whereas, in fact, most Muslims would prefer to have a system, including a religious system, which was, including a school system, which was more religious in its inspiration. I was listening to some of the earlier speakers about some of the anxieties that the Islamics feel in Western societies, a little bit isolated because of the secularized traditions. I feel sometimes the same. There was an article written about me on the Sunday papers in Ireland, which I haven't seen, but the headline was, "Man of the people and still yet man of the cloth," which seemed to be saying that I was Western, man of the people, of the people's ideas, but man of the cloth, somehow or other I had these strange religious ideas also, and that therefore I was hard to categorize in Irish society. And there are ways in which Irish society is finding it more and more difficult actually to categorize religion. The only particular specific problem we have at the moment is about Sikhs, and the Sikhs joining the Irish police force, and they will refuse to allow them to wear their turbans, whereas in Britain they've been able to do this. And I would say popular opinion will be in favour of the Sikh community in this. Last week I visited 3 of the major mosques in Dublin for the end of Ramadan. And I was quite surprised that 3 phrases were used consistently in those groups. The first one was that Irish Muslims feel they are safer and more welcome than in any other country in Europe. Something which I think is something we can be proud of if that is coming from an Islamic community, that they feel welcome and do not feel estranged and feel they can be themselves, also politically. Secondly, many said to me, "Thank you for your Catholic schools, which have enabled my children to remain Muslim." A strange phrase. And they identified and even named teachers to me, again, who had been doing this in a time when no other structures were there. And the third one, again, was, "We like what you say about social issues," which seemed to me to be saying that we have something similar in the way we look at the vision of society, that you can use religious terminology to address social issues. That is a good thing. Now, there are, however, misunderstandings and serious concerns about in that area. There's a grave lack of knowledge in Ireland about Islam, and therefore people may be at the moment benevolent, but it wouldn't take very long for the old stereotypes and cliches to take over. There's a scarcity of literature available for use in schools, and there are very few teachers of an Islamic background who have the qualifications to teach in our schools. And I think these would have to be addressed. I'm a firm believer, and I would pay, or allow, the state pays, but I would have to authorize, to have Islamic teachers or Quranic teachers in our Catholic schools, provided they have the same qualifications as any other teacher in the school, that they would have to have a university degree as any teacher would have, in order to safeguard actually the quality and the standard that one would expect religion to have. We have some problems now with regard to mixed marriages. It's more linked with high cultural diversity than specifically religious diversity, but it does cause problems when you get down to the question of the education of children. The basic question, I think that the problem of immigration and religious pluralism in Ireland is creating is the question of identity. And how do we define being Irish? Now, it's no longer just a question of red hair and freckled faces. That's long gone. we've had to come ourselves to ask the question about what does Irishness mean in our north-south tensions. That Irish does not mean Catholic, it doesn't mean nationalist, it has to embrace the different communities that are present in Ireland. I'm always amused to find that the very strong Northern Ireland unionist groupings, there was only one thing that brought them very clearly saying that they were Irish in recent years. And that was an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Britain, when they were delighted to say their cattle at least were Irish and could be exported to other parts of the world. But it shows that at times the sense of what it means to be Irish when traditionally it was very much a monocultural entity being Irish. We now have to accept that being Irish is much broader. And we have to try and identify through the school system what are the commonalities of being Irish. Obviously, acceptance of the law of the land, acceptance of the constitution of the state, but beyond that, we shouldn't be stressing a dominant stereotyped vision of what it means to be Irish. It's great to see some of the Islamic children, as happened to me the other day, coming and speaking to me in Gaelic, which they've learned very, very quickly and want to learn. The children want also to be part of the cultural milieu to which they belong. It gives them a certain sense of being part. But yet they clearly have their differences as well. We have a problem, it was mentioned here this morning again, about a sort of racicization of the religious issue, a confusion between immigration, asylum seekers, racial difference, and then religious difference. And not being so specific about the breakup of the different groups in our society. And here statistical information is vital. We have a strange situation. We've just had a census, and there's almost universal agreement, and certainly politicians are saying this all the time, the census didn't give us the right information, or even doubting the information the census turned up. And that's a very dangerous thing. We should be sure that when we gather information that is well prepared and that we can stand over. Now, when we move towards the future, I believe that the sort of human warmth and tolerance that has been shown in Ireland is simply not enough. We have to move into the other areas of increasing mutual understanding, and this isn't just an intuitive thing. It requires painstaking effort on various levels. When I begin at the third level in universities and theological institutions, I believe here that we need that painstaking research and understanding of each other's concepts, of each other's traditions, and that should be done on a multicultural and a multi-faith dimension, so we begin to understand and file down the differences that we have in our understanding of each other's. And it works both ways. I mean, Mr. Cherrick this morning was talking about infallibility, and I could give a few lessons on it's not quite as widespread as might be. And I think we all have to learn to understand and not to stereotype one another's theological positions. There's then another very important one. It's not specifically educational, but it belongs there as well. That's the broader one of sentiment and culture, in which we share and appreciate each other's cultural background and begin to and this can be done very well in a school environment, but it can also be done in a community environment, to the community to which the school belongs. The more we can integrate one another and appreciate and share one another's culture, the better. In the school, specifically school situation then, as I say, there's little background knowledge. We really need to break down the prejudices that each group brings with them, not knowing that they're prejudices. And this is the task, as what I call learning to read together. Not reading the textbooks, but reading our history together, and seeing where there are different ways of understanding the same events. We've done this to a good deal in our understanding of relationship between Ireland and Britain. We read our history together and try and understand both sides of a particular picture. You'll have to do the same about today's world. Learn to read the realities of today's world together so that we can come to a combined understanding. And part of that will be trying to read together the concept of public morality in a pluralist world, so that we arrive at something which belongs in a pluralist world without ever saying that our identity as religious people could only be worked out within a framework determined by a secularist environment, which be present in a dialogical manner in the world we live. And a lot of this work will have to take place in the teacher training organizations, teacher training institutions. That's vital that teachers have this ability. We're doing it at the moment in Ireland, but what we don't have are a sufficient number of Muslim teachers to provide that knowledge themselves rather than get it from books written by Catholic authors. That's nothing against the work that's done here by John Esposito, who is, as we heard this morning. The role of religion in education in general, what model should we be looking at? And this is a major political issue today, whether we should have state schools, which would be totally secular, state schools with generic religious information or information about religion, or denominational schools, which is the model we have so far. I personally am in favor of denominational schools with a great plurality of patronage and management. The other question we have to ask then is, what does integration mean? And what does diversity mean? And where do these two belong, or how you devise that? The examples of a very strong integration model haven't necessarily worked. The multicultural models haven't necessarily worked. This is the challenge, as I say, in a country where the challenge is new for us perhaps to be able to get it right. But it's not going to be easy. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 3/4 of an hour, which means that we have time for questions from all of you. But I'd first like to ask the panel whether anyone has any questions for any other member of the panel. I also would like to underscore that the economic issues got a little bit of short shrift, and the gender didn't come up, which is something that very often does in this dialogue. So just more for questions now rather than another round of comments. Osman, do you have any?
Well, in a way, to the question, the issue of gender, for example, when I raised the issue of illiteracy, in many Muslim societies, the high illiteracy rate results from the fact that half of the population, the female, has not been given the opportunity to receive education. So the issue of illiteracy there, for example, just now concerns that. But of course, I think in countries, many Muslim countries, there is equal opportunity, equal access to education for both males and females, access to jobs for those who have graduated, who passed from schools and so on. And in terms of the education, say religious education, of course, the kind of material, the content that is being passed to the students, that represents the dominant view of that Muslim society with regard to the place and role of women in society. In other words, the education system that tends to perpetuate the dominant view about gender equality or gender equity, or whatever you want to choose that the word. Yeah.
Diarmuid, do you have any questions?
No, but I didn't mention the economic issue. One thing is the Islamic population in Ireland is rather affluent. That We have a large number of people working in, we need doctors in Ireland, for example, we need engineers. So people have opportunity. It might be interesting to make just one comment on the economic dimensions of the Northern Ireland peace process, which was an interesting way of bringing estranged groups together. I don't think that the Northern Ireland peace process would have worked had the economic situation in Ireland not been so good. It was that the Unionists would never have talked to a nationalist community which ran a third-rate economy. They were driven they realized that the second point is that the success of the Northern Ireland peace process now depends on economic issues. It depends on the integration of the two sides and ensuring that all sides receive this economic benefit, which is actually there. That part of the situation in the Republic of Ireland is we need labour, and we have labour. We have our own Northern Ireland people who should be integrated into that. In the early parts of the peace process, some grassroots activities which had an economic dimension played a major role, and work which was done by the European Union and with some United States investment on border areas, which brought people who lived within miles of one another but hated one another. The economic building, increasing the economic sustainability of those areas created an attitude which is quite. On gender issues, again in Ireland we have a very, very high level of participation of girls in second and third level education and of women in the workforce. So far, the highly educated Islamic community who come have no difficulties with that. They fit into it very, very well and don't seem to be challenged. If we had some more traditional people, this might make a difference. But I think the fact that the Catholic school system, where nuns wore veils, there was something in the Catholics which didn't provoke suspicion on the part of Islamic parents, and I think that helped enormously.
Yeah, just about the gender issue. I think people make a lot of assumptions about the what is a traditional view of Muslims towards education and women in education that is not based on fact. The more historical research that's been done, the more we find that women were involved in all levels of education as students and as teachers throughout Islamic history, and that the big drop-off in women and girls' participation in education came during the colonial period. And whenever there is instability, women are the first who suffer, because women are more vulnerable in periods of insecurity, when there's not a good police presence in the street, when there are roaming gangs and things like that. Women, it's just the reality. Women are always more vulnerable, and so they start to lose out in education. That's true in Iraq now. Iraqi women were highly educated in great numbers, and they're suffering. All Iraqis are suffering, but Iraqi women and girls in particular, because they, if an Iraqi man goes out, he may be killed, and if an Iraqi woman goes out, she may be raped and killed, and it's just too high of a risk. It's also why the Taliban justified banning or preventing girls' education, was because of insecurity, whether that was an excuse or not. But having worked with Afghan refugees, I can tell you that in a camp of 100,000 people that was highly diverse, 95% of the camp wanted girls' and women's education. I was talking to a USAID officer yesterday who's opening up girls' schools all over Waziristan, to the great joy of the Pakistanis. So we have to look at what the reasons are if girls aren't being educated. Frankly, I'm more concerned about boys in developing economies and men, because studies have shown that in places like Saudi Arabia, in Jordan and Morocco, that you're starting to find that women are graduating in higher numbers from university, graduate schools, and professional schools than men. Why is that? women are highly motivated for this higher education because it gives them that ability to escape patriarchy and you know, to escape being under the control always of men. Now, why are men not going for that as much? And it goes back to what I said about having economic opportunities available. In fact, we see that, I mean, there have been studies in the United States about you know, there's different interpretations of the data, but it seems also here that boys are dropping off in some cases in terms of their interest and motivation for education. And just let me tie that to something that I didn't get to, but I think is very important, is the question of violence. I talked about secondary school and adolescence as such an important time in education. It's also where we see the potential for violence develop. And that's true whether it is in Muslim communities or in America. I mean, how many school shootings have we seen? How many schools have metal detectors in the United States? What is happening to boys that they are so violent now? So I think part of the Muslim or Western Islamic dialogue that should go on when we talk about education and society and economics is what the heck is happening to teenage boys and to young men that they feel that the place for them to, you know, the way to make their impact in the world is through some kind of act of violence in a very scripted, usually videotaped 15 minutes of post-mortem fame.
If I may add if I may add a point that what Ingrid has saying just now regarding the this possibility of the Muslim countries having this real problem. Not only in those countries which she has mentioned, but also in other countries, the trend is the same. The trend is more women than men are going to graduate from the universities. I can speak, for example, for the universities in Malaysia, where now practically in every school, every faculty, every school, you have more than 60% of the students are female. Now, what is really triggering kind of debate already when the same situation applies to the, for example, the School of Islamic Studies, which are going to produce the muftis and the what are called the court judges, the Sharia court judges, and so on. Not the men. So certainly, this is going to raise question about it has implications from the viewpoint of the Sharia. In these countries. Yes, I think the trend is worrying, and the question now, how Muslim societies are going to address this issue.
Well, let's open it up to the floor. We have mics coming right over here, please.
I can project as well.
I think it's arriving. And please introduce yourselves, and let's try to keep the questions short so we can have a lively conversation.
I'm Bridget. I'm coming from the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. And Professor Mattson, I think that Archbishop Martin's point that public morality in a pluralistic world has yet to be defined, for me, highlights the central problem with practical implementation with your laudable, but I'm not sure, again, how it could actually be practically implemented idea that in the states, at least, secondary education, the utilitarian model needs to be abandoned and something more inclusive of local moralities, local religions, perhaps, especially in urban areas where, as you rightly pointed out, it is not the Muslim world versus the West, because in America, we have both. It is the West, and yet there are vibrant Muslim communities, obviously. And so how disparate moralities and religions could be accommodated in one public school curriculum. If you could comment on that.
I must have not made myself clear because I didn't say what you said. I talked about the utilitarian model. I didn't say that it's necessarily bad, but you have to be clear on what the utility is. Is the utility going to be that of jobs? Is it going to be that of citizenship? Is it going to be that of being a good person? I think that in fact, I talked about elementary education as being the point where I think there's a reasonable assumption and need for formation on the basis of a pretty close reflection of family and community values. But secondary education, in fact, needs to be scrutinized very carefully, and this is where we as a society need to decide what we believe is the value of education for adults in formation, which is what adolescents are. I haven't given the solution, but I want to say that if it is to be a worker, then that can be of value if you have a very strong economy, and that's reasonable. Now, as someone who is an educator, I would hope that the value of secondary education would not be that narrow, but that it would be on a more holistic idea of a human being who has other aspects, their creative aspect as well. But if you look at one of the models, which is the model for most nation states, emerging nation states, there's a lot of emphasis on the citizen. Education, secondary education forming the citizen. That's beneficial if there's a realistic idea of political participation. But again, if it's an authoritarian state and the emphasis is on the citizen, then you're going to end up leading to a lot of frustration. So I'm not giving a solution, but what I'm saying is that it needs to be scrutinized. Why are these models or certain approaches clearly not working, because it's leading to people who are neither good citizens nor employable nor particularly happy human beings.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Actually, this is a related question. Ann Heald, Center for Multicultural Human Services. I wanted to ask Professor Bakar, you spoke to this same issue in a general way in your remarks. You talked about the Islamization of knowledge and that there was different content, pedagogy, and goals for education. Could you be specific, give some specific examples of some content difference, some pedagogy difference, and goal differences?
Well, I'm going to something which needs a bit of explanation, really. What is meant by the Islamization of knowledge? Well, the basic assumption here is that knowledge is context. The pursuit of knowledge has a social and cultural context. With its own sets of values. So this applies to the social sciences, to economics, and so on. I think it's related, first of all, to the something which was discussed earlier in the earlier panel this morning, the question of a worldview. That there is a worldview for, in a sense, there is a dominant worldview for every society or every community, and it is that worldview which, in a sense, is perpetuated through the education system. So, in the case of the Islamic, in the case of education in Muslim countries, there is a conscious attempt to make the religion of Islam or the worldview of Islam relevant to the kind of knowledge. And also the approaches to knowledge. Say, for example, just simply say the study of history. So the study of history in Islamic context would say call for a kind of some compatibility with what the Quran see human history. In other words, there's an attempt to conform, to strike that conformity between the Islamic views on life, on society, and what is the purpose of life. In other words, what is the purpose of life, and that purpose of life should be taught to the students. In other words, there are particular subjects that are being taught, certainly the subject of Islam, but even from the viewpoint of Islamization of knowledge, we need to look at the knowledge content of that is being taught in that subject, in that particular subject, whether it is in harmony or not with the views of Islam. So I think when Professor Anwar Ibrahim was the Minister of Education, Deputy Prime Minister in Malaysia, we had this Islamization of knowledge understood as not simply here sectarian Islam, but Islam in a universal sense, talking about the universal values that associated with that particular discipline or subject. But the concern is mainly in the case of the social sciences, like in sociology and so on, where the assumption, the basic premises of studying a particular group, of studying a society depends very much on the worldview. I think basically that is the crux of the matter of Islamization of knowledge.
You're next.
I'm Masood Haida. Perhaps there's a need to reinforce what is evident, although it didn't come out at this panel, and that is that apart from Ireland, the majority of Muslims that we've been talking about are poor, vulnerable, and poorly educated. The first result of this, in order to take this forward, is we've got to be clearer about numbers. Where are these poor Muslims? What do they need? How can we help them? The second is, and here there's a link with development, I'm glad to say. The link with development, especially if the majority of Muslims are poor, comes with things like nutrition. If you are poor and malnourished, already by the time you go to school, you've lost the race. And there's therefore a very important need, if you're talking of poor and malnourished Muslims, to emphasize the need for proper nutrition even before they reach school. Thank you.
Should we go there? And then I'll give you a chance to come in.
Hi, my name is Saad Omar. I'm a student at Georgetown University. Just one quick point about the Islamization of knowledge. I think that this is a topic that should be discussed in a more thorough fashion because it can be misunderstood when you're saying that secular knowledge or any knowledge should be Islamicized and compatible with the Islamic worldview and Islamic history. That could be seen as a strong bias and inducing Islamic biases into education. But my question is to Dr. Mattson. You were speaking about the exporting of certain utilitarian values to countries where it may not be as applicable. Could you talk about the flip side, works such as the works of Dr. Jeremy Hensel Thomas and the Book Foundation, where values that the Islamic spiritual tradition and maybe Catholic spiritual tradition share of soulful education and the more well-rounded education are being used to reform Western education, not Western Islamic education, but mainstream Western education and traditional models that can serve as guides for the enhancement of secondary Western education.
Could I just get a show of hands of how many people are waiting to? Okay, well, let's turn to the panel then and see. Ingrid, do you want to go first this time?
Well, let me just say that it's become clear to many people involved in education, as well as parents and ordinary citizens, that we want our kids in America to have from education something more than just useful job skills. That what's needed is somehow a sense of community among the children and commonality that binds them. Now, what we don't want is a narrow ethnic nationalism. You know, the Archbishop was talking about what it means to be Irish. We know that the conversation has shifted to values, shared values in many places. This is one of the things that Tony Blair emphasized in the last few years. But what does it mean? What are values? What are, especially for children, you can't just have these vague concepts. You need ideas that are grounded in practices. And that's where, really where the challenge lies. Finding some way, because we can have shared values that are lived in contradictory ways. And let me give you just one simple example. A saying that I always heard growing up from my mother, who is from a German-Irish background, okay, in Canada, is fences make good neighbors, okay? And one of the first Arabic proverbs I ever learned is ajar qabla dar, the neighbor, choose the neighbor before you choose the house. So that the idea, both of them are emphasizing the idea that it's important to be a good neighbor. Now, in one context, the way you demonstrate being a good neighbor is by minding your own business, right? Making sure you know that what's your property and what's theirs, and not crossing that boundary too much. In another culture, in Arabic culture, it's crossing that boundary, it's being involved, it's caring, knowing the details of what's going on in your neighbor's life and being very involved. So it's the value of neighborliness is lived in contradictory ways that could lead to, a funny 30-minute sitcom on, two neighbors from two different cultures. And that's, I think, in a pluralistic society where we really have our challenge. Now, for some of us, if we're living in a context where most of us are religious people, yes, we can draw upon our spiritual traditions for these values. We can talk about our particular practices and the way that charity and Catholicism and Islam come together, but not everyone's religious either. So that's where there's no easy answer to it, and at some level, you need your distinctive little circles of education, whether it's Sunday school or after-school education. But there should be, at a certain level, basic values that we can have, but I don't think it's easy. It's not easy. My son, who shifted from an Islamic school in elementary school to middle school to American public school, just about went crazy the first year trying to figure out where he was supposed to put his eyes, because he had been socialized to out of respect, look down when he was in the presence of an elder, a teacher, and when he shifted to an American public school, his teacher kept forcing his chin up and saying, look at me, thinking it was disrespectful not to look in his eyes. You can't do both. You can't look down out of respect and look at the person in the eye out of respect. And that's just a very trivial example of some of the challenges that we face sharing the same space. But in the end, I think, again, it's education. Why is one person doing that and one demonstrating the value in a different way?
Any burning further comments? We have a couple more questions.
I'd just say on the Islamization of knowledge and it comes back to this discussion we were having this morning again, the difference between science and faith. If we have a situation where you only take purely scientific knowledge as the only form of real knowledge, then we've lost something. But if you try for your faith to generate science, then you've lost the respect for that as well. On the utilitarian situation, it's a problem in many Western countries. Mrs. Thatcher, for example, decided that the Department of Education in Britain would become Department of Education and Employment, which was clearly indicated what she thought education was for. We have a situation in Ireland now of extraordinary pressure on people on second level, because the major decision about their future is taken at that level, no longer as it was in my time when you went into university. The major thing is getting into university and getting the points. With huge pressure on young people, we have in Ireland one of the highest teen suicide rates in the world, which is again the downside of a world of opportunity. And the other point that was made there about identifying the poor, one point I did make very strongly is the value of statistics. It's very important that when we're talking about phenomena which are at times new in dialogue and the movement of people, that as quickly as possible we try and move to have serious statistics which, and diversified, which will indicate exactly where we should be looking.
Can you wait, or do you want to say something?
Just still subject of Islamization. I just want to make a little clarification with regard to the issue of Islamization. I don't want to say that this there's been there's a lot of misunderstanding also about the term. Personally, I believe that the idea of Islamization is legitimate, but this concept, unfortunately, has been misunderstood, and also to emphasize here that the philosophical basis or assumption of Islamization of knowledge is that Islam is a way of knowledge. In other words, Islam as a way of knowing also, that it is not simply a way of doing things. And therefore, the resources, the intellectual resources of Islam do provide teachings on the various academic disciplines. In other words, with regard to epistemology or theory of knowledge. But I just want to emphasize here that when we use the word Islamization in the Islamic among Muslims, actually we mean two things. One, the universal dimension of that, which may not be indicated by the term Islamization. We could use another term to refer to that dimension, because that dimension is universal. An example would be, today we have a growing number of dialogues among the Abrahamic religions, the Muslims, Christians, and Jews on religion, the relationship between religion and science. That in a sense transcends any particular religion, because of the universal nature of the issues. But there are issues that are specific to the Muslim community, precisely because mainly because these are issues related to Islamic law, to the Sharia. So Islamization refers to both the universal dimension, which can be, as I said, referred to by using a neutral term, non-Islamization, but the other one is the more specific to the Muslim community. Thank you.
We have a little bit of grace until 4:10. I see two hands, so we'll take the two questions. Then I'll ask each of the panelists to respond and to say any final blinding notions that have come to them, and I will try to sum up very briefly a couple of action points. So. And you're next. You're the second.
Dan Madigan from the Woodstock Theological Center here at Georgetown. When it comes to the topic of development, which we haven't focused on terribly much in this section, I'm just wondering whether our definition of the question as an Islam-West question is not leaving out the most important elements when it comes to development, the enormous development of China, the enormous development of India, the enormous problems of development in Africa and in Latin America. So I sometimes wonder in all of our dialogue efforts whether we don't end up facing off against one another and making this into a face-to-face rather than forcing ourselves to stand shoulder to shoulder and look elsewhere, and whether that might not be more fruitful.
The next question is down here.
Thank you so much. I'm a professor here at Georgetown. I'm Yossi Shane. I was wondering, after listening to the Archbishop about the opportunities that presented themselves in Ireland due to the economic progress, which is very much associated with the opening of markets and the freedoms allowed by the Western societies. To what extent you or the other panelists think that there may be eventually tensions rising with regard to the demands of the markets, of people in the educational system, as opposed to the requirements perhaps put by the religious, I would say, belonging. We've seen it time and again in many societies, and it doesn't matter whether it's as Muslim societies or whether it's in Israel in the ultra-Orthodox community and others, that there is a huge gap emerging between religious communities who are remaining below the poverty line and really the demarcation line, and those who are entering the system of education, including, of course, higher education and scientific education, which eventually, of course, put pressure on them to enter the more, I would say, secularized society. And these kind of gaps, we have seen them in France. Those of us who study France, we see it in Britain in some places, and as I mentioned before, in Israel and other places. So how do you reconcile those? Because what you said, like these opportunities in Northern Ireland, especially between the Protestant and Catholics, these were all kind of like after arriving at a certain position regarding the point of religion in society. How do we reconcile that?
Okay, well, let's go from left to right this time. So, Dermot.
The economic success in Ireland is due to a number of factors. One was the quality of the educational system, and the quality sometimes with bad facilities, poor curricula, but great teachers who transmitted a passion for knowledge and prepared people to be able to enter into the knowledge economy. Along with that came an opening of the markets, which goes back many, many years. It was a high-risk operation for a country in its particular geographical position and in its historical position, which was one of isolation. We wanted to be independent Ireland, closed in on ourselves. And to open your markets then created a lot of risks for home industries and so on. But we also have a very strong social partnership model in Ireland, which again stresses that community dimension. That there is a social partnership policy which is agreed for a number of years. It's not pure market economy in that traditional sense. There are inadequacies. Our healthcare system is poor, and not enough money is being pumped back into the education which brought benefit to the community. But the Northern Ireland model is a slightly different one, and there what is important now, at the end of a crisis which had religious dimensions, that politicians do what politicians are supposed to do. Politicians are not there to talk about history and talk about battles of the past. They're there to see that there are roads, that there are infrastructures, that you have an economy that is favorable to investment and to build it up. It's a time for the religious leaders to stand back and not propose models of society, and for the politicians not to be preaching religion. This is a type of a healthy separation between faith and religion. It doesn't mean that that a healthy economic model would not have human and social and religious values, and they couldn't influence that. But the important thing there is that politicians do what politicians should be doing and haven't been doing over the years.
I think we should just end by recalling Sayyid Hossein Nasr's comments earlier about development and what we mean by that, and the fact that development is in some ways causing many of our greatest problems in the world today, that especially with the environmental problems that are leading to serious economic and political crises, military conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So one thing that we don't want to do is simply throw out some of the more traditional communities, some of the solutions that they've had to living in the world in a way that does not necessarily represent or reflect the kind of economic growth and consumption patterns that we've all associated with development, but may in fact be more sustainable. And with that, I want to tie that in to Daniel's comment about the Muslims and the West kind of standing shoulder to shoulder looking at the issue of poverty, because the reality is when we talk about Muslims, we're not just talking about poor people. There are very wealthy Muslims, and there are wealthy Muslim countries who are working very closely with Western capitalists to have these super hyper-developed capitalist communities. But guess what? There are other communities there who are not being educated, who are not enjoying the benefits. All you have to do is go to the Gulf. Georgetown has a campus in Qatar, and I'm not sure what who the manual laborers are there, who are sweeping the streets and cleaning the classrooms, and the nannies for the American and Qatari elite who are going to all these educational institutions. But if we necessarily conflate Islam and poverty and underprivilege, then we're going to be missing what is the clear ethical challenge, which is to develop, to look at the gaps and to learn from each other, so that the Muslim world doesn't simply reproduce the systematic injustices and gaps in social justice that happen, that can happen without proper regulation and attention.
I would like to conclude by making general remarks. Personally, I'm not in favor of perpetuating this problematic dichotomy Islam and the West, because I think both Islam and the Islamic, both Islam and the West are not monolithic. There is diversity within Islam, and there is diversity within the West. And the diversity with Islam, that has to be dealt by Muslims, how to deal with that diversity. Of course, Muslims also can learn from the experience of the West how to deal with this problem of diversity. And the second thing is that, talking about this diversity, so many of in a sense, there is a one-to-one, not one-to-one, but there are some correspondences with the diversity in the West. Muslims, those things which they regard as Islamic views, they can easily find counterparts in the West having the same views, even though the Western counterparts who have those views may not do so in the name of Islam. For example, in the case of religion and science, I have no problem of finding counterparts among Western philosophers of science or theologians of science with regard to the views, what should be the view, what should be the relationship between religion and science. The same thing with development and political science and so on. Muslim academics and scholars who believe in Islam, who believe in the Quran, can look for individual Western scholars who share the same view. And therefore, what is important therefore here is not the confrontation between Islam and the West, or the dichotomy, but rather to look for perspectives or schools of thought or philosophies in both in the East and the West, where we can find matches. We can match between one Islamic school of thought and say a Western school of thought, whether they agree or not. I think that would be more fruitful in the future, rather than sticking to the Islam and the West paradigm.
We've run out of time. I wanted to make just a very few bullet point conclusions that I drew from what I think has been a very valuable and rich exchange. I think one point that comes through very forcibly to me is the significance of diversity and of emphasizing the diversity of experience. I mean, clearly the experience that's largely represented in this discussion is of the successful and of the relatively prosperous segments within the West-Islamic engagement. But there are other parts of the world which I think are very different, which have been alluded to in the discussion. So the tremendous difference between a situation in Ireland, in the United States, in Malaysia, in Mali, in Zanzibar, and in Pakistan or Bangladesh, I think is something that we should not forget. We need to highlight that. The second thing which relates to that is that there were repeated emphasis on facts and information. And it is both the statistical information of having a better portrait of the societies and their dynamic, but also on some factual issues, including the perennial misunderstanding of the issues around the madrasa, which was referred to several times. I think our discussion focused above all on education, and it presents us, I think, with an interesting challenge, that clearly education is millions, if not billions, of people involved, and millions of different institutions. And the picture that emerged here was of quite an intense dialogue, debate, discussion going on about the ends of education, the relationship of education with the state, with religion, teaching about religion, teaching about civic values, the options available to parents, the relationship to the community. And I think the question here for us is how we try to capture that as a dialogue, because it's a very fragmented dialogue. And the engagement with issues of education, we've, I think, had reminders of the different segments, the elementary, secondary, special features, the links to the employment issues, to the transition to employment, the issues of university, the issues of theological education. All of them present, I think, a set of specific questions. We had, I think, tantalizing allusions to the issues of economics and the role that economic factors play in the dialogue processes and in relations. With, I think, first, clearly a sense that much more can be achieved when there is hope and opportunity and jobs. I think that's a very clear message. That this is a direction that needs to follow, but that the whole conversation about, in the same way as you asked for education for what, development for what, prosperity for what, with reminders that it is linked to the broader global issues of balance among different regions of the world, whether it's Africa or China or the Middle East, as well as the global warming issues. So I think we're left with a rich menu of questions and quite a few ideas on where to go next. So thank you all very much. Yes. And we'll resume at 4:30 sharp is the message. Okay.